We are getting some breaking news in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie.
What the Federal Bureau of Investigation has just unleashed in the Nancy Guthrie case is not merely a new lead. It is a weapon, a forensic instrument so powerful it has the proven ability to pull killers from the shadows, even after 40 years of silence. This is a weapon that remains indifferent to whether a suspect has ever been arrested, and it does not care if they have never left so much as a single fingerprint inside a law enforcement database. It is entirely unaffected by whether they wiped down every single surface, incinerated every piece of clothing, and vanished from the face of the earth. Because this formidable weapon does not need the perpetrator. It only needs one of their relatives. And right now, somewhere in America, a cousin or a sibling, perhaps a parent, has already provided investigators with everything they require, entirely unaware of their contribution. The FBI has unleashed investigative genetic genealogy in the search for Nancy Guthrie, and the world's leading DNA expert recently looked directly into the camera and delivered a chilling 4-word message to the individual responsible for her disappearance. You will be identified. We must begin at the moment this investigation collided with its first significant roadblock. For this story does not truly begin with genetic genealogy. It begins at the precise moment when it became the only option left on the table. During the meticulous processing of Nancy Guthrie's home, in the immediate days after she vanished, investigators uncovered something of profound significance: blood evidence on the front porch, which DNA analysis confirmed belonged to Nancy Guthrie. And then, they found something else: unidentified DNA, both inside and around the residence, that did not belong to Nancy Guthrie. It matched no known family member. It matched no one who had been identified as having legitimate reason to be inside that home. The discovery was publicly confirmed by Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos. He stated, quote, "We believe that we may have some DNA there that may be our suspect, but we won't know that until that DNA is separated, sorted out, maybe submitted to CODIS, maybe through genetic genealogy." And there it was, the very first public mention of the possibility. The plan was clear. First CODIS, and if that failed, genetic genealogy. CODIS failed. CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, is the Federal Bureau of Investigation's national DNA database. It holds nearly 27 million profiles, a staggering collection comprising more than 19 million convicted offenders and over 1 million forensic samples. It is a vast repository that has proven instrumental in more than 750,000 investigations since its inception in the 1990s. When investigators recover a DNA sample from a crime scene, their first and most immediate course of action is always CODIS. The system is fast. The FBI states results are typically returned within 24 hours of receiving a sample, and when it generates a match, the impact is decisive. But CODIS has one fundamental limitation. It only contains the DNA of individuals who are already in the system. This means people with prior arrests, convictions, or other contact with law enforcement significant enough to necessitate the collection of a DNA sample. If the suspect in the Nancy Guthrie case has never been arrested for a qualifying crime, if they have successfully remained invisible to law enforcement their entire life, then their DNA profile simply does not exist in CODIS. A search will yield absolutely nothing. This is precisely what transpired. The Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed it. DNA was recovered from a glove discovered approximately 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home. This glove, which appeared to match those worn by the masked suspect seen in the doorbell camera footage, was submitted to CODIS. The result was negative. There was no match. The DNA on the glove also failed to match the unknown DNA found at the property. This meant 2 separate sources of unknown DNA, 2 separate searches through CODIS, and 2 separate, frustrating dead ends. And it was at that critical juncture that investigators made the call every forensic expert observing this case had been waiting for. They turned to genetic genealogy. For anyone unfamiliar with investigative genetic genealogy, a process that once explained, is never forgotten here, is what it is and why it changes everything. Investigative genetic genealogy, or IgG, is a forensic process that takes a DNA sample from an unknown suspect and uses that genetic information to construct a family tree. The process involves working backwards through networks of biological relatives until investigators can zero in on the single individual who left that DNA at the crime scene. This method does not require the suspect's DNA to be housed in any law enforcement database whatsoever. It does not require the suspect to have ever had a single interaction with the criminal justice system. All it requires is that somewhere out in the vast commercial DNA databases that now contain tens of millions of profiles, a relative of that suspect has submitted their own DNA for something as innocuous as ancestry research. It could be a third cousin who took a 23andMe test simply to learn if they were part Irish. It might be a grandparent who submitted their DNA to Ancestry DNA in order to build a family tree for their grandchildren, or a sibling who used a consumer kit received as a Christmas gift. None of these people have any idea they may be connected to a violent criminal investigation. None of them, in any explicit sense, consented to their genetic material being used in this manner. Yet their profiles reside within these commercial databases, and it is from those profiles, from the shared genetic segments between a distant relative and an unknown suspect, that investigators can begin to reconstruct a family tree that will eventually lead to one name, one face, one address. CeCe Moore is the chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs, one of the country's most prominent laboratories specializing in forensic genetic genealogy. In the world of forensic science, she stands as one of its most revered authorities. She took her expertise to a national stage, appearing on the Today Show. Staring directly into the camera's lens, she delivered the precise message that a nation fixated on the case desperately needed to comprehend. She stated, "If I was the kidnapper, I would be extremely concerned right now because using investigative genetic genealogy, he will be identified. It's just a matter of time. A matter of time. Not a question of if, not a consideration of maybe or possibly. It was," she insisted, "an inevitability. To truly grasp the weight of that warning, one must delve into the mechanics of the process itself. The technical reality of how genetic genealogy operates is far more extraordinary than is commonly understood." David Middleman, a leading genetic genealogist and the chief executive officer of Aram Incorporated, one of the country's most preeminent forensic DNA laboratories, outlined the procedure with methodical precision. The journey begins when a DNA sample is recovered. It undergoes initial processing to create a unique genetic profile. This profile is then converted into a digital file, a code representing the unique genetic markers found within that sample. From there, it is uploaded into one of the publicly available genealogy databases. This is fundamentally different from the CODIS system, which confines its analysis to approximately 20 specific genetic locations. Forensic genetic genealogy casts a much wider net, scrutinizing an immense portion of the genome by examining 500,000 genetic markers along the full length of the DNA strand. This distinction is critical. The greater the number of markers examined, the more distant the familial connections that can be unearthed. With a resolution of 500,000 markers, the search extends far beyond immediate family members. Investigators can now identify third cousins, fourth cousins, and even relatives as remote as fifth cousins. These are individuals who might share as little as 1% of their DNA with the unidentified person of interest. From that point, investigators commence the meticulous process of constructing a family tree around each matching profile, drawing upon public records, birth certificates, and marriage licenses. They consult obituaries, census data, and social media to painstakingly map the branches of each family, searching for an intersection, an individual who aligns with the suspect's known profile, someone of the correct age, someone in the correct geographical location, with the correct background. The list of potential individuals is methodically narrowed, then narrowed again, and then, as was seen in the cases of the Golden State Killer and Brian Kohberger, a name materializes. At this juncture, the work of genetic genealogy is complete. It has furnished a crucial investigative lead, and the mantle passes back to traditional detective work. This involves surveillance, the collection of discarded DNA, and ultimately, a warrant for a direct sample to confirm the match. Middleman describes the potential outcomes with a clarity that leaves no room for doubt. He stated, "In the worst-case scenario, it will connect you to a very close relative. In the best-case scenario, gets it to your person. The logic is inescapable. Worst case, a close relative is identified, and the net begins to tighten from there. Best case, the suspect is identified directly. Regardless of the path, the net invariably closes. But this advanced science is not a silver bullet. We must now address the obstacles, because the path of this investigation is anything but a straight line. The hurdles confronting investigators during the genetic genealogy phase of this particular case are tangible, well-documented, and significant. The primary challenge originates with the DNA sample itself. Sheriff Nanos has confirmed that the DNA recovered from the property of Nancy Guthrie is a mixed sample, which signifies that it contains genetic material from more than one individual. Such mixed DNA profiles are, in the words of CeCe Moore, frequently encountered in violent crimes, but they also present a far greater analytical challenge. Susanna Ryan, the laboratory director at Pure Gold Forensics, a private DNA lab, articulated the complexity with precision. An ideal DNA sample, she explained, originates from a single source. However, laboratories are equipped to handle samples with two contributors, under the critical condition that the majority of the material belongs to the potential perpetrator. She clarified that labs can effectively process a mixture of, for example, 80% from contributor A and 20% from contributor B, but only if the person of interest constitutes that 80% component. But if the ratios are inverted, then there is typically little that can be done with that kind of mixture when it comes to the subsequent genealogical research. To put it in simpler terms, if the suspect is the major contributor to the mixed DNA sample found at Nancy's home, the lab has a viable path forward. If, however, the suspect is the minor contributor, the entire process becomes exponentially more complex, and in this case, the laboratory has indeed reported challenges. This was confirmed by Sheriff Nanos himself. He revealed to NBC News that the laboratory in receipt of the DNA had encountered difficulties with the sample. While he declined to specify the nature of those challenges, he did offer a detail of considerable importance. He stated, "Our lab also knows that the technology is moving so fast. The technology is moving so fast. This was not an evasion. It was a statement of demonstrable fact. The forensic DNA science of 2026 allows for the analysis of samples that would have been dismissed as unusable just 5 years prior. As little as 9 nanograms of DNA, an amount practically invisible to the naked eye, was sufficient to identify a suspect in a cold case that had remained unsolved for decades. The challenges with the Guthrie sample are undeniable, but they are not necessarily insurmountable. This leads to the second major challenge, the database problem. And it is an issue that has ignited significant controversy, as it lays bare a fundamental conflict between corporate privacy policies and the desperate urgency of an active abduction investigation. In the United States, a vast, invisible archive of human identity resides within the servers of 3 major consumer DNA companies. Ancestry, 23andMe, and MyHeritage collectively house the genetic profiles of more than 50 million people. That is 50 million potential links in a chain leading back to a suspect's family tree. Yet, for law enforcement, this entire universe of data remains beyond reach. All 3 corporations maintain strict policies that prohibit police from searching their databases without the explicit permission of the user, or, in rare instances, a court-ordered warrant. And historically, even when presented with such warrants, these companies have resisted them with formidable legal challenges. The genetic genealogy pioneer, Anne Ray Venter, the very scientist who unmasked the Golden State Killer, articulated the deep frustration caused by this barrier. In her own words, the 2 databases that we're allowed to use are 2 of the smallest databases. If we could be using Ancestry, or 23andMe, or even MyHeritage, those databases are huge. You're talking about 10 to 20 times as many people. If you're working on something like the Koberger case or the Nancy Guthrie case, suddenly time is really important. It's adding time to what was already a very timorous procedure. The databases that are open to law enforcement for these investigative genetic genealogy searches, GEDmatch, Family Tree DNA, and DNA Justice hold fewer than 2 million profiles combined. 2 million, measured against 50 million. The gulf between these numbers is more than just a statistic. It is the difference between potentially resolving a case like this in a matter of hours or seeing it stretch into months of painstaking work. CeCe Moore, a longtime champion of this technology, went even further. She issued a direct and public plea for help. She urged any individual with DNA data stored on the large commercial platforms Ancestry, 23andMe, MyHeritage to download their raw data file and voluntarily upload it to either GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA. It is a simple gesture, free of charge, that requires about 20 minutes and it could be the one act that finally identifies the person who took Nancy Guthrie. Moore stated the potential outcome in stark terms. If the perpetrator has deep roots in the United States, a match could be found in minutes, perhaps a few hours. But if it is someone whose family tree lacks recent connections to the U.S., the investigation could take significantly longer. The third challenge, and arguably the most politically fraught, concerns what transpired with the DNA evidence long before it ever had a chance to reach a genetic genealogy lab. Guthrie is a forensic genetic genealogy laboratory based in Texas. It was the lab instrumental in the case against Bryan Kohberger. Its work has been pivotal in cracking hundreds of other cold cases nationwide, some of which had gathered dust for decades. So when word spread that the Pima County Sheriff's Department had dispatched the DNA evidence from Nancy Guthrie's home not to a specialist like Guthrie, but to DNA Labs International, a conventional forensic lab in Florida, Guthrie's co-founder, Kristen Middleman, reacted publicly, and her response was anything but diplomatic. Her words were chilling. "This is so devastating." Then, she said something that sent a tremor through the investigative community that was closely monitoring this case. She stated, "DNA Labs International is a traditional forensic lab that consumes evidence to make an STR profile. So, I don't understand why it didn't go to Quantico, since they can do this better and faster than anyone. And they have a pipeline to flip it immediately to inferring identity with us. Consumes evidence. Conventional forensic labs, when conducting what is known as short tandem repeat analysis, use up physical portions of the DNA sample during the testing protocol. Once that biological material has been consumed, it is irrevocably lost. You can never get it back. Had the sample been sent directly to the FBI's renowned laboratory at Quantico, they could have performed their analysis and then immediately forwarded the resulting profile to a forensic genetic genealogy lab like Guthrie. It's the exact same pipeline that cracked the Kohberger case. Instead, it was routed through a Florida lab first. Was critical evidence consumed? Was the delicate sample degraded? Was the window of opportunity for a perfect analysis narrowed? These are questions that, on the public record, have never been answered. But Guthrie's public declaration makes the forensic genealogy community's opinion on that decision terrifyingly clear, devastating. And now, we turn to the cases where this technology worked as intended. Because the story of investigative genetic genealogy is not a story of abstract theory, it is a chronicle of tangible results. And those results are nothing short of staggering. For 12 years, the Golden State Killer terrorized the state of California. At least 13 murders, more than 50 rapes, and over 100 home invasions were attributed to him. He was a phantom. For decades, investigators possessed his DNA, but they could never attach it to a name. He was so cautious, so disturbingly methodical, that many in law enforcement privately believed he would die a free man. In 2018, genetic genealogist Barbara Ray Venter uploaded the killer's DNA profile to GED Match. She discovered matches to third and fourth cousins. She then spent 63 days meticulously building a vast family tree around those distant genetic echoes. At 3 o'clock in the morning, alone at her computer, she finally landed on a single name, Joseph James D'Angelo, a retired police officer, a grandfather, living a quiet, unassuming life in Citrus Heights, California. Investigators shadowed him to a local store. From a trash can, they collected a tissue he had discarded. The match was confirmed in just 4 hours. D'Angelo was arrested. He pleaded guilty to all charges in 2020. He now resides behind bars, condemned to a life without parole. And then, another name entered the national consciousness, Bryan Kohberger. In the chilling autumn of 2022, 4 students at the University of Idaho were brutally murdered, a crime that seized the nation's attention. There was no immediate suspect, no discernible motive, only the phantom of a killer who had operated with lethal precision and vanished with barely a trace. Investigators discovered DNA on a knife sheath left at the scene of the crime. From that sheath, a DNA profile was generated by Guthrie, the very same company whose co-founder had openly criticized the evidence handling in the Guthrie investigation. A vast family tree was methodically constructed using matches from public genealogy databases. The trail ultimately pointed to Kohberger's father in Pennsylvania. After retrieving a Q-tip from garbage outside the family residence, investigators confirmed the genetic connection and identified Bryan Kohberger as their primary suspect. Kohberger was taken into custody in January of 2023. In July of 2025, he was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms: a discarded pizza crust, a used tissue, a Q-tip from someone's trash. These are not the dramatic forensic revelations of fiction. They are the unremarkable artifacts of daily life, and yet they are delivering justice in cases that had no other conceivable path forward. The Nancy Guthrie case has now joined this solemn lineage. There is a detail within this investigation that has received far too little attention. A critical entry reported within a case evidence tracker. A single photograph, released by the FBI and separate from the doorbell camera recordings, depicts the suspect on the Guthrie property without the backpack and gun holster he was seen carrying in the other images. A source disclosed that this photograph was captured on a separate day, an entirely separate day. Investigators are now operating under the chilling theory that the suspect may have visited Nancy Guthrie's residence on multiple occasions prior to the night of her abduction. This detail is profoundly significant for genetic genealogy, because every visit to a property represents another chance to leave behind biological material. A single hair fiber, skin cells transferred onto a surface, aerosolized respiratory droplets, or trace DNA from fleeting contact with any object. If the perpetrator was indeed at the home on more than one occasion, conducting reconnaissance on the property, studying the positions of cameras, learning her routine, then the amount and integrity of DNA evidence available to law enforcement may be substantially greater than what has been publicly revealed. There may be mixed samples, partial profiles, but also, potentially, multiple deposits left across multiple visits. The laboratory challenges the sheriff described might not be the final word on what forensic science can ultimately extract from that scene. Here is what will happen next, and this is the part of the story that should command the attention of every person watching. The genetic genealogy process is already in motion. The laboratory work is ongoing, with the involvement of the FBI's team, a unit which, according to news reports, consists of 200 dedicated genetic genealogy agents. CeCe Moore offered a specific prediction on the timeline, stating, "I have worked on cases for years. However, I don't think this case will take that long because of the large amount of resources being dedicated to it. I would suspect the FBI genetic genealogy team would be brought in if it takes too long, and they have 200 agents." She estimated the process would take weeks to months, not years. Then she repeated her conviction in the clearest possible terms. She said, "If they have deep roots in the United States, this could be identified in minutes. If not, it takes longer. But they will be identified." Minutes. That is the upper limit of how quickly this technology can operate when every single variable aligns. On one end of the spectrum lies minutes, on the other, months. But what never appears on that spectrum is the word never. This technology does not produce never. There is one more facet of this story that deserves to be spoken aloud. Plainly, the suspect in this case, the masked figure captured in that doorbell footage, believed they were insulated from discovery. They wore gloves so thick that a profiler noted it compromised their hand dexterity. They wore a full ski mask. They manipulated their head at calculated angles to defeat the camera's field of view. They physically removed the camera from its housing. This entire operation was planned with what multiple former FBI agents have characterized as a sophisticated level of preparation and operational security. And somewhere within that meticulous planning, in their cold calculation of risk, they must have believed that DNA was simply not a factor. That, if they left no genetic fingerprint in the official databases, if they had no criminal history, if the National DNA Index returned nothing, they would be invisible. They failed to account for the aunt who used a cotton swab 3 years ago and mailed it to a genealogy company to discover which region of Europe her grandmother came from. They did not account for the second cousin who uploaded their raw genetic data to a public matching site merely to see what the results might show. They did not account for the brother or the nephew or the distant relative whose profile exists somewhere within those enormous databases. A completely innocent person who has no idea that their genetic information is now an integral piece of a forensic investigation into the disappearance of an 84-year-old woman from Tucson, Arizona. That is the fundamental mechanism of this technology. That is why CeCe Moore, a woman who has utilized this exact process to identify hundreds of suspects across hundreds of different cases, he looked directly into the camera and with an unflinching certainty made a declaration. The perpetrator, times will, times be identified. It was not a question of might be or could be. It was a statement of fact. If you possess any piece of information related to the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, a vehicle that seemed out of place, a person lingering in the shadows, a fragment of conversation overheard, a flicker of behavior that struck you as wrong, call 1-800. Call the FBI immediately. A reward of $1.2 million is waiting for the one piece of information that leads to Nancy's return. And for those who have explored their lineage, with a DNA profile stored on services like Ancestry, 23, and Me, or MyHeritage, a new path is open. You are urged to consider downloading your raw data file and uploading it to the public databases of GED Match, or Family Tree DNA. You may have no knowledge of a distant relative's dark history, but the FBI has a profound interest in uncovering it. Follow this case, as the investigation is active and ongoing. The science is advancing, the lab is processing, the intricate web of a family tree is being meticulously constructed, and for the person who believed they could exist as a ghost, time is running out. They are not invisible. They left a trace, and they were never truly gone.